The medical tent reeked of antiseptic and desert dust when Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera first laid eyes on her. She sat hunched on a cot in the corner, olive drab fatigues torn and bloodied left shoulder wrapped in field dressing that had already soaked through. Her dark hair hung in matted strands across her face, obscuring features that might have been striking under different circumstances. What caught Rivera's attention wasn't her injuries. He'd seen worse in his 8 years as a Navy SEAL medic, but the way she held herself, completely still, unnaturally quiet. "What's her story?" Rivera asked Corporal Jenkins, the Army medic who'd been treating her when Rivera arrived at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. "Jane Doe situation. Found her 3 clicks north of here unconscious next to a crashed Humvee. No dog tags, no ID, won't say a word." Jenkins shrugged, already moving toward his next patient. "Probably shock, you know how it is." Rivera approached slowly, his medic bag rustling against his thigh. The woman's eyes tracked his movement, sharp, alert eyes that didn't match the vacant stare of someone in shock. He'd seen enough trauma cases to know the difference. "I'm Doc Rivera," he said, settling onto a supply crate across from her cot. "Need to check your shoulder." She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge he'd spoken. But when he reached for her injured arm, her right hand moved in a blur, not aggressive, just precise. A pilot's instinct to protect controls. Rivera caught the motion and paused. "You fly?" he asked quietly. Still nothing, but something flickered behind those dark eyes, something that looked almost like pain that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. Rivera had been deployed to Afghanistan for 6 months, long enough to recognize the signs. The way she favored her left side suggested more than just the obvious shoulder wound. The careful way she breathed indicated possible rib damage, but it was her silence that bothered him most. In his experience, people talked when they were scared or hurt. They cried, they complained, they asked questions. This woman did none of those things. He began his examination with practiced efficiency, noting the calluses on her hands, definitely a pilot's hands. The tan line on her wrist where a watch had been. The small scar above her right eyebrow that looked like it came from ejection seat trauma. Details that painted a picture of someone far more experienced than her apparent age suggested. As he worked, Rivera became aware of something else unusual about his patient. Despite her silence, despite the obvious pain she had to be experiencing, she was studying him. Not just watching, studying. The way a professional evaluates another professional. The mystery deepened when he removed the field dressing from her shoulder. The wound was clean, precise, shrapnel, but not from an IED or mortar. This looked like aircraft debris. High-velocity fragments from something that had been flying fast when it came apart. "This is from a crash," he said, more to himself than to her. For the first time, she reacted. Just a slight tightening around her eyes, but Rivera caught it. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tent flaps, casting everything in golden hues that reminded Rivera of better days. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter's rotors beat a steady rhythm against the desert air. The woman's eyes moved toward the sound instinctively, then back to Rivera's face. In that brief moment, he saw something that made him set down his medical instruments and really look at her. Recognition, professional recognition. Rivera had spent enough time around pilots to know that look. It was the same expression he'd seen on the faces of Air Force and Navy aviators when they heard their aircraft. A mixture of longing, identification, and something deeper. Something that spoke of hours spent in cockpits, of muscle memory developed through countless flights, of reflexes honed by emergency procedures practiced until they became second nature. "You know that sound," he said. It wasn't a question. She closed her eyes, effectively ending the conversation. But Rivera had seen enough. This wasn't just another casualty. This was a pilot, and given her apparent experience level, probably an important one. The question was, why was she here without identification? Why the silence? And most importantly, what had she been flying when everything went wrong? The helicopter's sound faded into the distance, leaving only the low murmur of voices from other parts of the medical compound. Rivera finished cleaning her wounds in thoughtful silence, his mind working through possibilities. Missing pilots meant search and rescue operations. SAR operations meant radio traffic, missing aircraft reports, concerned commanders asking questions. But nobody had been asking questions about this woman. As he applied fresh bandages, Rivera noticed something else. Despite her injuries, despite the obvious trauma of whatever crash had brought her here, she showed no signs of confusion or disorientation. Her eyes tracked movement around the tent with tactical awareness. She monitored the positions of everyone present, kept track of entry and exit points, evaluated threats and opportunities with the unconscious efficiency of someone trained in survival. This wasn't a victim. This was a warrior who happened to be wounded. When Rivera finished his examination, he sat back on his heels and studied her face. She had strong features, high cheekbones, determined jaw, skin weathered by sun and wind in ways that spoke of time spent at altitude. But it was her eyes that held his attention. Dark brown, almost black with flecks of gold that caught the light. Intelligent eyes, careful eyes, eyes that had seen things and made decisions under pressure. "I'm going to help you," he said quietly, "but I need to know who you are." She met his gaze steadily, and for a moment Rivera thought she might respond. Instead, she looked away toward the tent opening where late sunlight painted everything in shades of amber and gold. Her expression grew distant, almost wistful, as if she was remembering something important. Or someone. That night, Rivera found himself thinking about his mysterious patient long after his shift ended. He sat outside his hooch, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the desert sky. Somewhere out there, aircraft were flying missions, transport runs, reconnaissance flights, close air support for ground units engaged with the enemy. He wondered which of those missions might be missing a pilot. The next morning brought new casualties and familiar routines, but Rivera made sure to check on the woman first. She was awake when he arrived, sitting on the edge of her cot with her feet on the ground. Someone had found her clean fatigues, though they were obviously borrowed, too big in some places, too small in others. Her color looked better, less of the pallor that had worried him the day before. "How's the pain?" he asked, settling into his usual position on the supply crate. She looked at him without answering, but there was something different in her expression. Less wariness, maybe, or perhaps just resignation. Rivera began his examination, checking the shoulder wound for signs of infection, testing range of motion, evaluating her overall condition. As he worked, he kept up a steady stream of professional commentary, partly for his own notes and partly in the hope that she might eventually respond. Shoulders looking good, no signs of infection. Range of motion is limited, but that's expected with this type of injury. Ribs seem to be healing well, probably just bruised, not broken. You're lucky. At the word lucky, she made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. Rivera paused, not feeling particularly fortunate. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Rivera saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Pain that went far deeper than any physical injury. Loss. Guilt. The kind of emotional wounds that could take years to heal if they ever did. "Someone didn't make it," he said softly. It wasn't a question. Her jaw clenched, and she turned away, but not before Rivera saw the answer in her face. The morning sun climbed higher, bringing with it the familiar sounds of a forward operating base coming to life. Generators hummed, vehicles rumbled past the medical tent, radios crackled with routine communications. Through it all, the woman sat in silence while Rivera finished his examination. As he prepared to leave for his next patient, she spoke for the first time. "Viper." Her voice was hoarse from disuse, barely above a whisper, but the single word carried weight that made Rivera stop and turn back. "That's your call sign." She nodded once, then seemed to disappear back into herself. Rivera spent the rest of that day thinking about call signs. In his experience, they weren't chosen randomly. They reflected something about the pilot, personality, appearance, flying style, sometimes an incident that defined their reputation. Viper suggested someone fast, dangerous, precise. Someone who struck without warning and left devastation in their wake. But looking at the wounded woman in his medical tent, Rivera saw something else entirely. He saw someone who had been broken by whatever mission had brought her here. Someone carrying guilt so heavy it had stolen her voice and left her hollow. That evening, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going off duty, Rivera walked to the communications tent. Staff Sergeant Williams, the night shift radio operator, looked up from his equipment with raised eyebrows. "Doc, what brings you to my little corner of paradise?" "Need you to run a search for me. Missing pilot, call sign Viper, probably within the last 72 hours. Williams frowned. "Doc, if we had a missing pilot, don't you think?" "Just run the search, Williams. Humor me." The radio operator shrugged and turned to his computer terminal. Rivera waited, listening to the soft clicking of keys and the background hum of radio traffic. Outside, night was falling over the desert, bringing with it the temperature drop that always surprised newcomers to Afghanistan. After several minutes, Williams let out a low whistle. "Doc, you better sit down for this." Rivera pulled up a chair, his pulse quickening. "Got 3 hits on call sign Viper. 2 are male pilots, currently accounted for and on active status. But the third—" Williams turned his monitor so Rivera could see the screen. "The third is classified so far above my pay grade I'm surprised my computer didn't melt trying to access it." Rivera stared at the partial information visible on the screen. Most of it was blacked out, but he could see enough to understand that his patient wasn't just any pilot. The classification levels, the restricted access warnings, the multiple redacted sections. This was someone involved in operations that officially didn't exist. "Can you tell me anything?" Williams looked around nervously, then leaned closer. "Off the record, the little bit I can see suggests this Viper is attached to a unit that doesn't appear on any organizational charts, the kind of unit that flies missions nobody talks about afterward." Rivera felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The precision of her wounds, her tactical awareness, the way she'd been found with no identification. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure Viper's identity remained hidden, even from her own medical team. "Thanks, Williams, and this conversation never happened." "What conversation, Doc?" Walking back through the base, Rivera's mind raced. If his patient was involved in classified operations, then her silence made perfect sense. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting mission details that could compromise ongoing operations or get other people killed. But it also meant she was carrying the weight of whatever had gone wrong entirely alone. The next morning, Rivera approached her cot with new understanding. She was awake, as always, sitting in that perfectly controlled position that spoke of military discipline ingrained so deeply it had become unconscious. "Major," he said quietly. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with something that might have been fear. Rivera held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I didn't go looking for details, but I know enough to understand why you can't talk about what happened." She studied his face for a long moment, then seemed to relax slightly. "The thing is, Major, you're healing physically, but you're carrying something else that's eating you alive from the inside. I've seen it before. Whatever happened out there, whatever you think you could have done differently, it's going to kill you if you don't find a way to let some of it go." She looked away, but Rivera could see the tension in her shoulders. "I'm not asking you to compromise operational security. I'm not asking you to tell me about the mission. But you need to understand that whatever happened, the fact that you survived means you have something left to give. People are counting on you to heal and get back out there." When she looked back at him, Rivera saw tears she refused to let fall. "He didn't make it," she whispered. Rivera nodded. "Your co-pilot. Navigator, best in the business, had 3 kids back home." Her voice cracked. "It should have been me." The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had finally burst. Rivera listened as she told him about Lieutenant Colonel James Roadrunner Martinez, a navigator with 15 years of experience who could find his way through any weather, any terrain, any threat environment. About how they'd been flying together for 2 years, how they'd become more than just crew, they'd become family. About how she'd made a split-second decision that saved the mission, but cost him his life. Rivera let her talk, offering no platitudes or easy comfort. He'd learned that sometimes the most important thing a medic could do was simply witness someone's pain without trying to fix it. When she finished, they sat in silence while the desert sun climbed toward its merciless midday peak. Finally, Rivera spoke. What was his favorite thing about flying? She looked surprised by the question. Sunrises. He said every sunrise looked different from altitude. Used to take pictures, send them to his kids. Then he died doing something he loved, with someone he trusted. It wasn't much, but Rivera saw something shift in her expression. Not healing, that would take time, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. That afternoon, Major Viper asked for his help writing a letter. Rivera brought paper and pen, settling beside her cot as she dictated words meant for a family he would never meet. The letter was careful, revealing nothing about the nature of their mission while conveying everything about the man who hadn't come home. She spoke of Martinez's professionalism, his dedication, his love for his family. She spoke of how he died quickly, without suffering, serving his country with honor. She didn't mention that he died because she'd chosen to complete the mission instead of turning back when their aircraft took damage. She didn't mention that in the seconds before impact, he'd reached over and squeezed her shoulder, letting her know he understood her choice and supported it. Some truths were too heavy to share with grieving children. When the letter was finished, Rivera watched her fold it with precise military creases. Her hands were steady now, no longer trembling with suppressed emotion. "Feel better?" he asked. "No, but it feels right." Rivera understood. Sometimes doing the right thing and feeling better were entirely different objectives. That evening, he found her outside the medical tent, standing at attention and staring at the darkening sky. A transport helicopter was approaching from the east, its navigation lights blinking against the first stars. "They're coming for you," Rivera said, joining her. She nodded. "Debrief tomorrow, then back to the world for medical leave. And after that, back to work if they'll have me." Rivera studied her profile in the fading light. The physical wounds were healing well, but he could still see the deeper damage. The weight she carried would never completely disappear, but he could also see something else: determination, purpose, the kind of strength that emerged from surviving something that should have been unsurvivable. "They'd be fools not to have you." She turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, she almost smiled. "Thanks, Doc, for everything." The helicopter was closer now, its rotor wash beginning to stir the dust around their feet. Soon it would land, and she would climb aboard and disappear back into whatever classified world she'd emerged from. Rivera would probably never see her again, never know if she made it through her medical leave, never know if she found a way to forgive herself for surviving when her navigator didn't. But as he watched her prepare to board the aircraft that would take her home, Rivera knew he'd witnessed something important. Not just the healing of physical wounds, but the first tentative steps toward healing something deeper. The kind of healing that happened not through forgetting, but through remembering with purpose. The helicopter settled onto the makeshift landing pad in a cloud of dust and noise. Through the side door, Rivera could see figures in civilian clothes, probably intelligence officers come to collect their asset and begin the delicate process of determining what had gone wrong with whatever mission had brought Major Viper to his medical tent. She turned to face him one last time. "His kids," she said, "will you make sure they get the letter?" Rivera nodded, understanding that she was entrusting him with something precious. She walked toward the helicopter with the controlled stride of someone accustomed to walking away from things that mattered. But just before she reached the aircraft, she stopped and looked back. "Viper wasn't my first call sign," she said, her voice barely audible over the helicopter's engines. "It was Ghost." Then she was gone, climbing into the helicopter's dark interior. Rivera watched as the aircraft lifted off and banked toward the west, its lights disappearing into the vast desert night. He understood now why they'd changed her call sign. Ghost was someone who appeared and disappeared without leaving traces. But Viper was someone who left a mark. In the days that followed, Rivera found himself thinking about their conversation whenever he treated other wounded warriors. He began to understand that healing wasn't always about making the pain go away. Sometimes it was about learning to carry it with dignity, to transform it into something useful rather than destructive. 3 weeks later, he received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph, a sunrise taken from high altitude, all gold and crimson and impossible beauty. On the back, someone had written, "From Roadrunner's collection," in careful handwriting. Rivera pinned the photograph to the wall of his hooch, where it caught the light from his desk lamp every evening when he wrote reports. It reminded him that every sunrise was different from altitude, and that some truths were worth carrying, even when they hurt. 6 months later, Rivera was reassigned to a medical unit in Germany. The transition from desert medicine to garrison life was jarring, but he adapted with the flexibility that came from years of military service. His new duties involved treating wounded warriors during their recovery process, men and women dealing with injuries both visible and hidden. One gray morning in November, he was reviewing patient files when his commanding officer knocked on his office door. "Doc, got someone asking for you specifically. Says you two met in Afghanistan." Rivera looked up to see a familiar figure in the doorway. She was wearing Air Force dress blues now, with ribbons and decorations that suggested her career had progressed significantly since their last meeting. The haunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by something Rivera recognized as hard-won peace. "Major," he started, then stopped when he noticed the rank on her shoulders. "Colonel." She smiled, and Rivera realized it was the first genuine smile he'd ever seen from her. "Hello, Doc. Heard you were helping people heal. Thought I might stop by and see how you were doing." They talked for an hour, carefully avoiding classified details, but sharing the kind of conversation that was possible between people who had shared something meaningful. She told him about her medical leave, about the long process of learning to sleep without nightmares, about gradually rebuilding trust in her own judgment. "I'm flying again," she said as their visit wound down. "Different missions now, training mostly. Helping young pilots understand that making hard choices is part of the job, but it doesn't have to destroy you." Rivera nodded, understanding that she'd found a way to transform her experience into something valuable for others. "Martinez's family?" he asked. "We stay in touch. His oldest daughter is thinking about the Air Force Academy, says she wants to be a navigator like her dad." As she prepared to leave, she handed him a small wrapped package. "For your wall," she said. Inside was another photograph, this one showing two aircraft in formation against a brilliant blue sky. Rivera recognized the sleek lines of modern fighter jets, though he couldn't identify the specific models. "New call sign?" he asked. She grinned, "Phoenix." Rivera watched her walk away, understanding that some stories didn't end so much as transform into something new. The woman who had sat silently in his medical tent, carrying guilt that threatened to consume her, had become someone who could help others navigate their own darkness. That evening, he hung the new photograph next to the sunrise picture. Together, they reminded him of something he'd learned from treating wounded warriors, that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about finding ways to honor it while building something better for the future. Years later, when Rivera retired from military service and began working with veteran support organizations, he would often tell people about the importance of witnessing pain without trying to immediately fix it, about how sometimes the most healing thing you could do for someone was simply to sit with them in their darkness until they were ready to find their own way back to the light. He never used names or identified specific individuals, but those who listened carefully could hear in his voice the respect he held for warriors who had learned to carry their scars with dignity, who had transformed their deepest wounds into sources of strength for others. And sometimes, on particularly difficult days when he was counseling veterans struggling with guilt and loss, Rivera would think about a sunrise photograph and remember that every dawn looked different from altitude, and that difference was what made each one worth seeing. The last time Rivera saw Phoenix, she was standing at a podium addressing a room full of young Air Force officers. Her speech was about leadership under pressure, about making decisions when lives hung in the balance, about learning to trust yourself even after you've made mistakes. In the audience, Rivera noticed several older officers whose ribbons and bearing suggested they'd seen significant combat. They listened to Phoenix with the attention reserved for someone who had earned the right to speak about such things through experience rather than theory. Leadership, she was saying, isn't about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them, honoring those affected by them, and using that knowledge to make better decisions going forward. Every choice we make in the cockpit affects not just ourselves, but everyone who depends on us to complete the mission and come home safely. Rivera thought about a letter written to children who would grow up without their father, about a navigator who had died trusting his pilot's judgment, about the long journey from guilt to acceptance to purpose. Some of you will face moments where there are no good choices, only necessary ones, Phoenix continued. In those moments, remember that your training, your experience, and your commitment to the mission are what will guide you through. Trust yourself, trust your crew, and understand that sometimes the greatest act of courage is continuing to serve after you've experienced loss. After her speech, Rivera approached to congratulate her. She greeted him warmly, and they spoke briefly about their respective work with wounded warriors and veteran support. "You know," she said as their conversation wound down, "I still think about what you told me that day in the medical tent, about how surviving meant I had something left to give." Rivera smiled. "Looks like you figured out what that was." She glanced toward the young officers filing out of the auditorium, their faces serious as they contemplated the responsibilities that lay ahead of them. "I hope so. Every sunrise is different from altitude, right?" Rivera nodded, understanding that she'd found her own way to honor Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's memory while building something meaningful from tragedy. As he watched her leave, stride confident, bearing proud, purpose clear in every step, Rivera reflected on the nature of healing and service. Some wounds never fully closed, but they could become sources of wisdom and strength. Some losses never stopped hurting, but they could be transformed into gifts for those who came after. The woman who had once sat silent and broken in a desert medical tent had become someone who could help others navigate their own darkness. In doing so, she had honored not just her navigator's sacrifice, but the deeper truth that survival always came with obligations, to remember to serve, to help others find their way home. That night, Rivera wrote in his journal about the importance of witnessing transformation, of understanding that healing was rarely about returning to what was, but about becoming something new and valuable from what remained. He wrote about sunrises and photographs, and the kinds of conversations that could only happen between people who had shared meaningful darkness. and he wrote about the privilege of watching someone discover that their deepest wounds could become their greatest sources of strength, not despite their pain, but because of what they had learned by carrying it with grace. The story of Major Viper, Colonel Phoenix, and Doc Rivera became part of the unofficial oral tradition passed between military medical personnel, never told with names or identifying details, but shared as a reminder of why their work mattered beyond the immediate treatment of physical injuries. In medical tents and aid stations around the world, medics and corpsmen would sometimes reference the pilot who wouldn't talk when discussing the importance of treating invisible wounds alongside visible ones. The story became a teaching tool about patience, about the difference between healing and curing, about the necessity of sometimes simply witnessing pain without immediately trying to fix it. Rivera, now retired and working with veteran organizations, would occasionally hear variations of the story told by other medical personnel. The details changed. Sometimes it was a Navy pilot, sometimes Army, sometimes the setting was Iraq instead of Afghanistan. But the core elements remained constant. The silent warrior, the patient medic, the gradual recognition of deeper wounds, and the eventual transformation of trauma into purpose. He never corrected the variations, understanding that stories like this belonged to everyone who had lived them in their own ways. Every medic had encountered warriors carrying invisible wounds. Every treatment facility had patients who needed more than bandages and medication to truly heal. The real lesson wasn't about any specific individual, but about the universal truth that healing often required not just medical expertise, but human connection, patient listening, and the wisdom to understand that some battles continued long after the fighting stopped. On the 20th anniversary of his deployment to Afghanistan, Rivera received an invitation to speak at an Air Force symposium on combat stress and military medicine. The keynote speaker was listed as Colonel Phoenix, no real name given, in keeping with operational security requirements. Rivera smiled when he saw the program. Some stories, he realized, never really ended. They just continued in new forms, touching new lives, creating new possibilities for healing and growth. He accepted the invitation, understanding that he would once again have the privilege of witnessing transformation, not just his own journey from military medic to civilian counselor, but the ongoing evolution of a story that had begun with silence in a desert medical tent and had become something larger than either of them had imagined possible. The symposium was held at a major Air Force base, with attendees from across the military medical community. Rivera arrived early, taking time to walk through the static displays of aircraft that reminded him of the machines that had carried both salvation and sorrow through desert skis. When Colonel Phoenix took the podium, Rivera was struck by how completely she had grown into her role as someone who could speak about the hardest aspects of military service with both authority and compassion. Her presentation was professional, informative, and deeply personal without compromising operational security. She spoke about the evolution of military medicine's understanding of combat stress, about the importance of treating warriors as whole human beings rather than just collections of symptoms, about the necessity of addressing invisible wounds with the same urgency and expertise applied to physical injuries. Healing, she told the audience, is not about forgetting or getting over traumatic experiences. It's about integrating those experiences into a life of continued service and purpose. It's about understanding that survival always comes with obligations, to ourselves, to those who didn't make it home, and to those who will face similar challenges in the future. During the question period, a young Air Force medic asked about dealing with patients who refused to discuss their experiences. Colonel Phoenix was quiet for a moment before responding. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be present with someone in their pain, not trying to fix or analyze or diagnose, just being willing to sit with them in their darkness, until they're ready to find their own way back to the light. Some of the most profound healing happens in silence, when people feel safe enough to begin processing their experiences without pressure to explain or justify them. Rivera recognized his own words from decades earlier, transformed by experience and wisdom into something even more valuable than he'd originally understood them to be. After the symposium, Rivera and Phoenix walked together across the base, their conversation ranging across decades of shared understanding about the complexities of military service and the challenges of helping wounded warriors heal. "You know," she said as they paused beside a memorial wall listing names of airmen killed in action, "I still have that sunrise photograph. It's in my office now, where young pilots can see it during counseling sessions. Helps them understand that their experiences, even the painful ones, can become part of something beautiful and meaningful." Rivera nodded, understanding that the photograph had become more than just a memorial. It had become a symbol of transformation, of the possibility that even the deepest losses could contribute to something valuable for others. "Martinez would be proud," he said. "I hope so. His daughter graduated from the academy last year. She's a navigator now, assigned to transport operations. Says she wants to make sure everyone gets home safely." They stood in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that some conversations could only happen between those who had shared certain experiences. Around them, the base continued its daily operations, aircraft taking off and landing, personnel moving between assignments, the endless cycle of training and preparation that kept military forces ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. As their visit concluded, Phoenix handed Rivera a small box. "For your retirement," she said, "something to remember that healing is always possible, even when it seems impossible." Inside the box was a compass, not a modern GPS device, but an old-style magnetic compass with brass fittings and careful craftsmanship. Engraved on the back were the words, "For finding your way home, from someone who learned that's always possible." Rivera understood that the gift was about more than navigation. It was about the deeper journey they had shared, from darkness toward light, from despair toward purpose, from individual trauma toward collective healing. "Thank you," he said, meaning far more than the words could convey. As he drove away from the base that day, Rivera reflected on the nature of legacy and service. The woman who had entered his life as a broken, silent figure had become someone whose influence would ripple outward for decades, touching the lives of countless warriors who would benefit from her hard-won wisdom about surviving and thriving after trauma. His own role had been small but significant, not healing her, exactly, but creating space for her to begin healing herself. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important thing one person could do for another was simply to witness their pain with respect and patience, trusting that healing would follow when the time was right. That evening, Rivera placed the compass on his desk next to the sunrise photograph that had started it all. Together, they reminded him of something he'd learned from a career spent helping wounded warriors, that every person contained the potential for transformation, that every wound could become a source of wisdom, and that the most profound forms of healing often began with the simple act of one human being sitting quietly with another in their darkness, waiting for the dawn.